Hey guys, welcome to my combined Guass build and Cyath Zaw build. I could have made a separate video for each, but I have been using the Cyath in several of my other videos, and I decided that I would rather just explain the Cyath in detail in this because these two go together very well, as I'm going to show you later. And Guass is one of those warframes that you don't see people playing very often, and you have to wonder why, considering that he has a really amazing kit. He's also one of those jack of all trades kind of warframes where they have almost every ability in the game, all combined at once, like energy income, tankiness, scaling damage, everything you can think of, right? Energy grouping, I mean enemy grouping, sorry. Um, but on this build, I'm going to focus on a few different areas and how I improved their performance. So I'm not going to get into detail about every single synergy that this Warframe has because it's going to take forever. So I'm just going to explain the synergies as I'm explaining the different parts of this build and how things interact with one another. But first and foremost, I think it is important to go over the casting order of Thermal Sunder. Thermal Sunder is a complex ability in and of itself, and to fully understand it, you would probably need at least 30 to 40 minutes of reading the article length page on the wiki about it. And that's why I'm not going to go into everything that it does and how exactly to use it. Instead, what I'm going to do is show a few things so I can then later show how my build changes them. So first off, the order in which you cast Thermal Sunder on the same area matters. So there's two ways to cast it. If you tap cast, it freezes enemies or applies a cold proc to them. If they have a cold proc on them and you cast it, it then adds another cold proc and freezes them in place. The cold proc doesn't have to come from Thermal Sunder. It could come from weapons, for example, but enemies that have a cold proc and you apply Thermal Sunder to them, they will then, on cold proc mode, will get another cold proc and freeze in place. So if I tap, it puts a cold proc. If I tap again, it freezes all enemies in place. That is tapping Thermal Sunder. Now, if instead of tapping it, let's wait for these to go away. If instead of tapping it, I would hold cast it, it would put a heat proc instead. Now, it puts 2 because I'm using Archon Vitality. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But if you cast heat again, it just doubles the amount of heat procs that they have on them. And the way heat works in this game is that it's cumulative damage, so that the more heat procs they have on them, the more damage they take. It takes into account damage from previous casts, even more so on Guass, because if you just subsume Thermal Sunder on a different Warframe, it cannot take advantage of the full range of what this does. Because it interacts with his batteries in ways that I'm going to explain shortly. But first, now let's explain what happens when you cast different types. So if they have a cold proc on them and then you apply heat, or if they have a heat proc on them and then you apply cold. So they either get pushed or pulled according to the order. So if we want to push them out, we would hit them with a cold proc. Then a heat proc, they get pushed out. Now, it also does something else. I'm going to get into that shortly as well. But if they have instead a heat proc, and then you apply a cold proc, it pulls them in. And then you could apply another cold proc and freeze them in place. Okay? So that's so far about the order in which you cast it as far as pulling and pushing is concerned. Now, there's more to it than that, because you have your battery, which is a little bit of a pain to charge, which is why we're going for a lot of extra duration, because it takes a little bit of time to charge it, and you want to have as long as possible of having maximum battery before the ability runs out. So we're just about there. Now, at full battery, heat does double the damage of the prior heat procs that they have on them. So if we just keep doing this, it doubles the damage, except what you're seeing now is not double the damage, it's quadruple the damage. Why is it quadruple the damage? That is because of Archon Vitality. Archon Vitality says that whenever status effects from abilities that deal heat damage will be applied twice. Now, the status effect comes from the damage of Thermal Sunder the first time you apply it, but then when the battery is full, this is a synergy between Thermal Sunder and Redline. When the battery is full, then instead of casting cold twice to freeze enemies, now as soon as you cast Thermal Sunder once to put one cold proc on them, they instantly freeze. That's a different behavior. Another thing that changes is that the heat procs take all of the current damage after it applies the heat procs and doubles that damage. And what Archon Vitality does is, oh, wait a minute, he just got a heat proc with a ton of damage. Well, I guess I'll have to add another heat proc with equal damage. So that's what it does. It basically quadruples the damage of Thermal Sunder consecutively. This is the scaling part of this build, where the more times you cast heat version of Thermal Sunder, you double the previous damage until all the enemies eventually die. Especially in conjunction with Nourish, which makes them die even faster, because then the damage is applied to their health directly. Never mind, it's pretty crazy. So there's a few ways you could think about how would I go about applying all that heat to enemies when the battery is full. So one combo, for example, could be you start off by casting cold. They all freeze in place when the battery is full. When that happens, then you cast heat. It pushes them out and gives them a heat proc, takes away the cold, and leaves the heat instead. And then you just keep with the heat, as you did before. That's one way to go about it. The other way would be, well, if I do that, then it pushes the enemies out. And if enemies are too spread out, then it might push them outside of the range of the next cast. So if that's the case, you would then start with heat, then cold. It would pull all the enemies in, and then it would pull all enemies in and freeze them, and then you start with your heat combo, which would then push them out again, but then also apply heat procs, which would double and double and double and double. So those are the two casting orders that you could use Thermal Sunder for, but there's one component of Thermal Sunder that I didn't explain yet, and that is the armor stripping. So when your 4 is activated, Thermal Sunder strips armor based on the percentage of battery that you have. So at 100% battery, it will strip 100% of enemy armor, which is what we're aiming for. And what that would look like is even stronger. So now we activate Nourish. We want to do our whole thing. So we start with casting cold, then we cast heat, then we cast heat. Well, they all died again before we even managed to cast the second heat, right? They just instantly disappear. Why? Well, because when you put cold and then fire, it takes away the cold, it leaves the fire, and it transforms the cold into a blast proc. Now, the blast proc, when your 4 is disabled, all it does is it just applies damage based on all of the procs that they have, which includes heat. So you can scale your heat with Archon Vitality and casting heat, Thermal Sunders, then apply a cold. The cold is going to transform the heat into a blast proc, which if Redline is active will strip armor, and if not, it won't. But that blast proc, its damage is going to be equal to all of the damage from all of the heat procs and cold procs that they have on them, which are, like I said, the damage values double as you keep casting it because of both the combination and Archon Vitality, quadrupled, sorry, and quadrupled again and again and again every time you cast it. And then all of that scaling damage gets applied to the blast proc, which takes into account everything as if it ticked all the way. So not only does it take the current damage per second tick of the fire damage, but it condenses all of the future ticks as well into that blast damage. So what you just saw, all of those enemies disappearing instantly, what happened was very complex, so let's break it down. I applied a cold proc, which froze them in place. I then applied a heat proc. The heat proc transformed that cold proc into a blast proc. The blast proc started off by stripping 100% of enemy armor. It then applied a heat proc that did all of the damage of both the heat proc and doubled with Archon Vitality, with the damage from the cold statuses all condensed, all the future ticks per second condensed together into that blast proc. The damage from the blast proc gets applied after the armor is stripped, and because the heat was the second one that was cast, it's also the status that remains on them in addition to blast. So they lost the cold, they got blast instead in an armor strip. And the heat proc is just because you just applied heat, so they have that heat, doubled because of Archon Vitality, and then you can keep spamming heat again, which quadruples all of that previous damage that I just described, including including all of the previous damage that I just described and all the future ticks per second, etc. Meaning that duration also strengthens the damage output of all of these abilities. Probably even more than ability strength. I'll get into that in a second too. This build scales its damage way better off of ability duration than ability strength, but again, we'll get to that later when we get to the build itself. But that's what basically makes all these enemies die so quickly, because they take damage multiplied fire procs when they've already had their armor stripped and they have viral procs from Nourish on them. So all of that together just makes them die very, very quickly. These are level 180 enemies. And of course, this only happens when your battery is full. One last thing that's worth noting is that cold makes your battery fill, while heat drains your battery by a flat amount. That is important to know because when you want your battery to be charged at 100%, you have to kind of keep an eye on your battery meter on the right. As you can see, that's the thing that's above the ammo. Okay, so that is the part of the build that concerns specifically Thermal Sunder. But that's not all. There's one more part of this build, and that is utilizing Mach Crash together with maximum range. Now, all of his abilities in general benefit from maximum range, and one more reason we're going for max range is because ability strength, you can compensate from it outside of mods, with Mult Augmented, for example, like I'm doing here. Duration, you can compensate it for it outside of mods, like with Mult Efficiency, like I'm doing here. Or with applying Archon Shards, like I'm doing here. I applied Archon Shards for duration, and as I'm going to explain later, ideally you would want all of these to be duration, if possible. And of course, all of them, if you could have the Tau Forged Crimson Archon Shards, just fill them with 5 of those, that would be ideal. Because it correlates with damage output in various ways, both from the fact that status duration of Thermal Sunder statuses gets longer the longer your duration is, meaning they keep each status for longer. and it lengthens the length of thermal Sunder less, meaning it applies them more statuses over time. But also, Redline is directly affected by duration and not by ability strength. So let's say, if you can see, it's between 14 to 72 attack speed. Wait, what's going on here? If I lower Blind Rage, it's still between 14 and 72 attack speed. That doesn't change at all based on ability strength. It's based only on ability duration. For some reason, that's how DE decided to do this. Okay, so back to Mock Crash. Mock Crash is going to group enemies for us in a 22 point something meter radius, and a 22.5 meter radius, I believe. And the other part of this build that I said we're going to get into is this Zaw, which is the Cyath. And what I'm going to showcase now is what happens with both of those. So again, let's try to get full battery again, because it's best showcased like that. Not even full battery, but full gauge. Okay, so we have Nourish active, yes. So when you rush into a wall, it leaves this vortex, which then allows you to easily dispatch all of those enemies. Now, okay, what is so special about a grouping ability? Everybody has them. Well, it's not special, except that we're also using a melee weapon that's going to use this in very interesting ways. So, before we get into that melee part of the build, as I explained, that was all the beginning of this video, was all about the thermal Sunder and how it works with battery versus non-battery. And that's important because we're going to use this to strip armor, mostly. To strip armor and to deal with large groups of enemies, nuking them with heat procs. But that's not all this build does. As you can see, it groups enemies so that you can dispatch them very easily with weapons boosted by Nourish. Nourish does a bunch of things for us here, and this is the section of the video where we're getting into Nourish. So Nourish, what it does is a few things. It gives you a flat damage increase on your weapons. It also applies viral damage to your weapons. Meaning that you don't need to mod for viral. You could take out any viral mods that you had on them, and of course all melee weapons greatly benefit from viral stacks, so that's pretty great, because then you can save 2 mod slots on each melee weapon, which we're going to use in the melee weapon section of this video. It also gives you an energy intake multiplier, and energy intake multiplier is why we replaced Guass's second ability. Now, Guass's second ability, what it does, and why we subsumed it out, is it gives you protection up to 100% incoming damage immunity from all physical damage types. So slash, impact, puncture, heat, cold, and blast. But it doesn't help you at all against toxin. It doesn't help you at all against electric, magnetic, radiation. And those are some of the more annoying things to get on you. So it almost seems as if that ability doesn't do much. I've also tried it on Steel Path, and the damage you take despite it giving you a pretty hefty defense is nice. I mean, it's nice, but it's not that great. You still take damage unless it's at 100%. The problem is that it's only at 100% when you're at 100% battery with Redline. But when you're at 100% battery, every time you take a hit, it takes 6.5% or more off of your battery charge. So then it gets lowered from 100%. So the next hit is going to damage you, and the hit after that is going to damage you even more. Basically, it's not as great as it seems. Sorry. But in addition to that, it would also give you energy based on the damage that you take. So Nourish replaces that very well in that it doesn't drain your battery as you take damage, but it still gives you a way to increase your energy intake in a different way. So that would flat out give you energy whether you're dashing or not. This unfortunately gives you energy as long as your energy is not draining, which does happen while you're holding Mach Rush. It drains your energy, so you can't really pick up if you pick up an energy orb from Mach Rush while you have well, actually energy orbs work, but let's say if you had energy regeneration, which the melee weapon gives us, that is not going to work while we're dashing. On the other hand, since we can't really hold dash and heavy attack at the same time, it doesn't really matter. And the bottom line is, it doesn't really matter after all. So the only thing that's special about this melee weapon is that its heavy attack does 360-degree spins that kills all enemies in an area. And that is going to be very useful when we have a vortex that pulls all enemies in the area into the very small area that we need to just spin around in it and kill all enemies. That's the reason why we chose the Cyath Zaw, because that's the only Zaw whose basic attack, whose heavy attack, does several 360-degree spins that damage all enemies in the area 4 times. That's pretty crazy, so that's why we chose that Zaw. And again, with Mach Crash, we pull all the enemies into that radius. We spin around. Our weapon is going to get boosted by Nourish. And now we get to the melee weapon section of this video. Well, why heavy attacks? Why did I choose a weapon that specializes in heavy attacks? Well, that's because Exodia Brave on heavy attacks gives us energy regeneration. A pretty hefty one, like 15 per second at 3 stacks. For 4 seconds, which is plenty. So let's say 15 energy for 4 seconds, that's 60 at full stacks. Well, that 60 is going to get multiplied by at least 2.4. I'm saying at least because we also have Molt Augmented, so the energy multiplier is going to scale up over time as we progress in the mission by a little bit, up to, I think, near times 3 the energy intake. So let's just say times 2. So times 2, that would be, instead of 60 energy, that would be now 120 energy after 4 seconds. That is roughly enough to cast Redline. That is more than enough to cast Thermal Sunder. So you don't really need any orbs. You don't really need anything. You can just pull all enemies into a group. It's not as effective, obviously, when you don't have Redline, but let's do it anyway with just this. So we pull all enemies into a group, and then we just blender them to death. And as soon as enemies die, they will give us an energy regeneration buff, as you can see, that times 3 on the top for 4 seconds, which is way more than enough to fill our energy. So even if we waste all of our energy, let's spawn more enemies. So what you could do is go in here. You could also cast Thermal Sunder to help you kill these guys. And look how fast our energy fills all the way back up again. We can help keep casting it. We can keep casting our abilities. Yeah, so that's the idea. Now, not only that, but I've modded it for critical damage. I've built it for critical damage, sorry, and not for much status chance, which we don't really need. We want the flat damage to kill them as quickly as possible. The viral procs are going to help us do that. We don't really need statuses on them, per se. And the way we built this is condition overload, self-explanatory, just more damage. Primed reach is going to allow us to hit way more enemies as we spin around. That means that when we do a heavy attack, it's going to have an almost 6-meter radius around us, in which it does 4 heavy attacks worth 2,000 damage before any of the buffs from viral procs on the enemies or other stuff like that. or from or at all from nourish. Nourish is going to also apply a viral to this. Well, ignore the riven, because if you don't have this exact riven, then you won't have corrosive on it. It would look just like this. So in your case, it would just add a flat viral. So you would put something that in this pot that would either increase flat damage or increase critical damage or something like that. I maybe even put whatchamacallit, gladiator might in here instead of, if you don't have a riven. But my riven, unfortunately, I'm still working on it. But it will give me corrosive. So now I'll have viral corrosive. You don't necessarily have to have this corrosive, but my point is we don't have to mod this at all for viral. So we can count on the viral from nourish to allow us to build this for even more damage or even more utility. Corrupt charge just doubles the damage from heavy attacks, self-explanatory. This is going to increase critical damage, which is crucial for us because this is a critical damage based heavy attack weapon. Sacrificial steel and sacrificial pressures to increase crit damage as much as possible, but if you don't want to sink an umbral mod in there, you can just go with just sacrificial steel without sacrificial pressure and replace sacrificial steel with a prime pressure point instead. And that way you could still have enough with just putting one of these forma, and you'll be able to do that and get away without you'll have enough capacity without wasting an umbral mod on it. And I mean an umbral forma on it, sorry. And last but not least is life strike, which again on heavy attack, which this weapon is based on, will give you life steal on hit, not even on a kill like Exodia Brave will. This one just on hit will flat out keep you alive, which is necessary because in order to get all viral procs on enemies, we're using combat discipline. Combat discipline is going to drain our health as we kill enemies, but because it's going to deal damage to us as we kill enemies, it's going to proc nourish. Nourish is going to then apply the viral to all enemies, basically to help us kill them faster. As we kill them, it's going to make us lose more health, which will trigger nourish again. Debuffing the enemies again, which we will kill more easily because they have viral on them, so we can kill them with combat discipline again, lose health. Again, you get the picture. Multi-efficiency is here because the more ability duration you have, the better the stats are at full battery. The percentages you see here are 14 at an empty battery and 72 at full battery. Now the battery stays at 80% as long, can only be topped up to 80% as long as you don't use Redline, and Redline is what allows it to reach its maximum potential, so to speak. But now, if I were to replace, for example, Augur Reach with Narrow-Minded, it would take a huge chunk out of our range and sacrifice that for a pretty insane boost, but we don't really need that, as I'm going to show you. I mean, the attack speed is enough. So we're going to boost our weapons' attacks and all of their various stats with this. Of course, casting speed, which is also very, very, very nice. And with Nourish, we're going to boost our weapon damage and apply debuffs to enemies to basically make them take more damage. So these abilities are going to help us deal more damage to enemies and take them out faster. This ability is going to help us group them. This ability is going to help us strip armor from them. And this is the entire kit, stripped down to its most simplified and uninteresting components. Of course, there's way more nuance because Mock Rush, for example, when you hit a wall to trigger Mock Crash, you have to hit a solid object. It deals an AoE damage, which also scales off of Nourish, the damage that you deal to them, because they're going to get debuffed and have viral procs on them. But in addition to the impact damage that you see here, it also picks up along the way elemental damage procs from the thermal Sunder fields that you run through. So you can add cold and heat to that as well. That's another synergy that he has. And Mock Rush casting ability is halved when Redline is active. And as I said, Thermal Sunder synergizes with Redline by making them instantly freeze from one cold proc instead of two, taking double the heat damage from Thermal Sunder heat, and stripping armor. That's how Redline synergizes with Thermal Sunder. None of these synergize by default with Nourish, except all of them do inadvertently because Nourish is an enemy debuff. And it applies damage to your weapons, so you can also hit them while they're in Vortex. So, without further ado, let's get into actual gameplay. Oh, by the way, we're going for max range because all the abilities scale off of range. And again, there's no way to buff range outside of mods, but you can boost both strength and duration with external stuff like Archon Shards and Arcanes. So, let's go into a Steel Path mission to show you how this deals with Steel Path enemies, spoiler alert, very easily. Let's go to the version of Steel Path that has the highest level enemies in the game so far. I'm gonna kind of shut up here because I'm really bad at both explaining and both explaining and playing at the same time. So just enjoy the gameplay. Now I choose the Nurik because it allows me to gain energy without any enemies being around, which is kind of nice. We start our battery. Pull all enemies here. I lock my... Oh, by the way, I locked my melee weapon so that it won't switch to anything else by mistake. Pull all enemies, we keep killing them. Meanwhile, our battery is charging. Oh, this guy here is going to help us, but yeah, that's not what you're going to get in normal missions, but increasing range and ability strength is pretty nice for... Oh, damn it. I should shut up. Damn it. And you don't want to use heat too much because it's going to drain. Yeah, it's going to drain your battery. So at least at first you want to kind of chill with it a little bit. Now that the battery is full, we can kill them with just the heat procs. And the armor strip, of course. So as you can see, when you need energy, just dash into the wall. It's gonna help you fill your battery a little bit. It's going to CC all the enemies so you can kind of hit them and apply all the Thermal Sunder to them way more easily. Yep, that's basically the build. This is actually better done with the King Dragon Key. Because, yeah, molt efficiency. doesn't really trigger as easily if you don't have any shields on, so you have to kind of be aware of that. That's why Archon shards are far superior. As soon as I would fill all of the Archon shards with duration ones, I'll probably switch Molt Efficiency to something else, maybe Arcane Blessing to have a higher health pool. Yep, this is essentially it. And as you can see, if I just apply heat a bunch of times, they just flat out die, even without stripping armor first, because of the scaling damage of it. Now, one last thing I want to show you is what it looks like with Felarx. This is the Felarx, okay? Look how fast it reloads. So, yeah, that's why I'm using the Felarx in this build. Yeah, where? It fires faster than, it fires faster than, it looks like I'm shooting a Fenmore when I'm actually shooting a shotgun. Pretty crazy. Yep. I guess I'll show the Fenmore build, I mean the Felarx build while I'm at it, as one last component, bonus footage or whatever, but it is really useful because I've been able to, using a Guass, one-shot an Acolyte to the head and take it out, one-shot Kuva Lich to the head to take it out, and one-shot Sentient to take it out. And I'm modding for as much multi-shot as possible. So, of course, this Riven, the only reason I'm keeping it despite the fact that it has no multi-shot on it is because it goes negative critical chance. Negative critical chance is going to help me proc the Incarnon Evolution 5 of it. Never transform this weapon, by the way, because as you can see, it fires very quickly on semi-auto when we have, oh yeah, maybe it was firing super duper quickly because we had narrow-minded, but trust me, it fires quickly enough even without it. Oh yeah, and we were really suboptimal in that Steel Path run. We had nerfed range by a lot. So yeah, ideally you want to increase range, as I said, duration, sorry, as I said, by applying as many of those as possible. Yep, but most importantly, we're going for primary frostbite, which on cold status effect gives you +3 critical damage, which isn't critical chance. And it's not as useful, therefore, but it also gives you a lot of multi-shot, a pretty hefty sum of multi-shot. And all it requires is cold status effect, which with this much multi-shot is not going to be a big deal. And the multi-shot coming from it will help proc even more cold status effects. So I'm going for corrosive cold because viral is going to get added because of nourish. So just the viral slash is going to help kill enemies. Cold from Prime Chilling Grasp is going to be the most dominant one, so it's going to be the most likely status to hit to apply on them, and also it's going to be most likely what's going to kill them. And if they die from and if they get status effects, then again you increase your multi-shot. Yeah, this is pretty crazy. And the more multi-shot you have, when you fire this quickly, it's pretty great. And you have an extra 104% damage from viral to that, don't forget. So you're going to be spraying viral slash cold all over the place, in addition to corrosive, and all of that goes together with this. So keep in mind the Felarx is kind of like a bonus, or like the cherry on top. Mainly you would want to lock your Zaw in place, the Cyath, and just spin around and blender enemies to death. Yep. Have a nice day, guys.